I still remember the first time I stood on that land. There was no noise, no traffic, no voices, just wind moving through open space, the kind of quiet that makes you breathe slower without realizing it. That was the moment I thought, this is it. This is what freedom feels like. I didn't buy that property to get rich. I didn't buy it to flip it. I bought it because I wanted something simple, land that belonged to me, where no one could tell me how to live. And the best part? It was outside the HOA, not inside, not governed by it, not subject to its rules, fees, or meetings. The HOA neighborhood sat nearby, neat and organized like a brochure. Same-style houses, trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes. I respected it from a distance, but I didn't want to be part of it. I wanted space, privacy, control. On paper, everything looked perfect. In reality, there was one problem I hadn't fully understood yet. There was no proper road. Not a real one, anyway. There was a narrow dirt path that people had been using for years. It wasn't official. It wasn't maintained. It was just there. In dry weather, it filled the air with dust. In the rain, it turned into thick mud that grabbed your tires and refused to let go. The first time I drove down it after buying the land, I thought, okay, this is rough but manageable. The second time, I realized it wasn't. Every bump rattled the truck. Every dip felt like a warning. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was unreliable. And unreliable access turns land into a liability fast. That's when I understood something important. Owning land doesn't mean much if you can't reach it properly. So I started looking at options. And very quickly, those options turned into a choice that would change everything. I could use the HOA's internal roads. They were paved, clean, well-maintained. They connected directly to the main road. On the surface, it seemed like the obvious solution. But nothing with an HOA is ever just about convenience. Using their roads meant asking permission, signing agreements, accepting conditions, paying fees. And once you do that, you're no longer fully independent. You're tied in. Even if you're not officially a member, you're still under their influence. The other option was harder. Build my own road, on my land, with my money, under my responsibility. It would cost more upfront. It would take time. It would be work. No one would help. No one would thank me. But it would be clean. No strings, no assumptions, no future leverage. People told me I was being stubborn. Why spend all that money when the HOA road is right there? You're making this harder than it needs to be. Just work something out with them. But I've learned something over the years. The things that seem easiest at the beginning often cost the most later. I didn't want favors. I didn't want exceptions. I didn't want to owe anyone anything. So I committed to the hard option. I did everything by the book. I hired professional surveyors to mark the exact property boundaries. Not guesses. Not approximations. Exact lines. I wanted zero ambiguity. I went to the county and pulled permits. I talked to inspectors. I made sure drainage wouldn't affect neighboring properties. I checked setbacks. I followed regulations most people don't even know exist. This wasn't just about building a road. It was about protecting myself. When construction finally started, it felt surreal. Heavy equipment rolled in. Dirt was cut and shaped. Gravel was layered and compacted. Day by day, something solid replaced something uncertain. I watched it happen from the edge of the property, thinking about how long that land had been there without a proper path. And now, slowly, it was changing. When the road was finished, it didn't look fancy, but it looked right, strong, straight, reliable. It was mine. The first time I drove on it, I didn't rush. I rolled slowly, listening, feeling the surface under the tires. No slipping, no sinking, no second-guessing. For the first time since buying the land, access wasn't a question anymore. I remember standing at the end of that road one evening, watching the sun drop low, feeling something I hadn't expected. Relief. I thought the hard part was over. I thought the problem was solved. I was wrong. A few weeks later, I opened my mailbox and saw a clean white envelope with a familiar logo. The HOA's logo. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just a notice about nearby construction or neighborhood updates. I almost tossed it aside without opening it. Almost. Inside was a letter. Short, professional, polite, and right there in the middle of the page was a number that made me stop breathing for a second. $300. The letter said it was an access and maintenance fee. I read it again, then again. I actually laughed, out loud, because I wasn't using their roads. I had just spent a small fortune building my own. So I set the letter down and shook my head. This has to be a mistake, I said to myself. I had no idea that this little piece of paper was about to turn my quiet purchase of land into something very different. Something much bigger and much uglier. At first, I honestly thought that first HOA letter was just a mistake. A computer glitch. A checkbox marked wrong. Some intern clicking the wrong address. So I did what most normal people would do. I ignored it. I didn't call. I didn't email. I didn't panic. I had built my own road, on my own land, using my own money. There was nothing to argue about. At least that's what logic said. But HOAs don't run on logic. They run on routine. And routine expects compliance. About a month later, I opened my mailbox again and saw the same logo, same envelope, same return address, different energy. This letter felt heavier before I even opened it. And when I did, I knew immediately this wasn't a reminder. It was a warning. The tone was sharper, shorter, more confident. It talked about outstanding balance. It mentioned late fees. It included a deadline. This wasn't a suggestion anymore. This was pressure. The letter said my property benefited from HOA infrastructure and was therefore subject to an access and maintenance fee. That sentence stuck with me. Not uses, not accesses, not travels on, benefits from. It was vague on purpose, flexible, designed to stretch just enough to cover whatever they wanted it to cover. I sat there holding the letter, and something clicked. This wasn't about roads. This was about assumption. HOAs survive because most people don't question them. They pay because arguing feels exhausting. They comply because the paperwork looks official enough to be scary. And for a moment, I understood why this tactic works. Because even when you know you're right, doubt sneaks in. I caught myself thinking, what if I'm missing something? What if there's some rule buried deep in their bylaws? What if fighting this costs more than paying it? That's the psychological game. Make the number small enough to seem easier than resistance. $300 isn't life-changing. It's not a lawsuit. It's not a foreclosure notice. It's just annoying. And annoyance makes people give up. But the more I thought about it, the more something bothered me. If I paid this fee once, it wouldn't stop there. Next year, it would be another fee. Then an increase. Then special assessments. Then conditions. And suddenly, I'd be tied to an HOA I never agreed to join. That's when I decided I wasn't ignoring this anymore. But I also wasn't going to attack. Anger gives them something to point at. Calm forces them to respond. So I wrote back. The email was simple, clear, respectful. I explained that my property was not part of the HOA, that I had built a private road entirely on my own land, that I did not use HOA roads for access. I attached documentation, property surveys showing boundaries, photos of the road under construction, permit approvals from the county. I didn't accuse them of wrongdoing. I didn't threaten. I didn't argue. I just stated facts. And I ended with one sentence. Please review the attached documents and confirm that this invoice has been issued in error. I hit send and felt confident. Facts don't lose. Or so I thought. Their response came 2 days later. 2 days. That was the first red flag. Because there was no way they had reviewed everything I sent that fast. Surveys alone take time to understand if you actually care about accuracy. This response didn't feel reviewed. Felt pre-written. They thanked me for my message. They acknowledged receipt of my documents. And then they rejected everything. The letter said that access was assumed based on proximity. That my property still benefited from community infrastructure. That fees were standard practice. And then I read the sentence that made my stomach tighten. Payment is mandatory. Mandatory. That one word changed the entire situation. Mandatory means authority. Authority means legal backing. And if they were wrong about that, they were stepping into dangerous territory. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. This wasn't confusion anymore. This was a power move. They weren't asking if they were right. They were telling me they were. And that's when I stopped thinking like a homeowner and started thinking like someone who needed to protect himself. I didn't respond. Instead, I started digging. I pulled up county property records. I searched for recorded easements. I read through HOA bylaws and state property laws. I wasn't looking for loopholes. I was looking for truth. And the deeper I went, the clearer something became. The HOA was very confident. But confidence doesn't create rights. Documents do. And I was starting to realize that there might be something they were counting on me never checking. Something that, if exposed, could flip this entire situation upside down. Because if they didn't have legal authority to charge me, then that meant something else. It meant they might be relying on access they never actually owned. And if that was true, then this wasn't about me owing them money. This was about them owing me answers. I kept reading, late into the night, and somewhere between zoning maps and easement law, I felt that shift again. That quiet shift. The moment when you realize the ground under someone else's confidence is thinner than they think. And that's when I found it. Or rather, that's when I realized what wasn't there. That night I didn't sleep much. Not because I was angry, but because my mind wouldn't slow down. Every time I closed my eyes, that word came back. Mandatory. Kept echoing in my head like a dare. So instead of lying in bed, I sat at my desk with a laptop, a cup of coffee, and one simple goal. Find out what they were counting on me not knowing. I started with the obvious stuff. County property records, deeds, plat maps, the boring documents most people never read unless they absolutely have to. First, everything looked normal. My property lines were exactly where I thought they were. Clear, clean, undisputed. The HOA's boundary stopped well short of my land. So I went deeper. I searched for easements. An easement is basically a legal permission slip. It's what allows someone to use land they don't own. Roads, utilities, walkways, none of that works legally without one. If the HOA had the right to charge me for access, there had to be an easement somewhere. I searched the county database. Nothing. I searched again using different keywords, different dates, different parcel numbers. Still nothing. At first, I thought maybe I was missing something. Maybe it was filed under an older record or bundled into a larger agreement. So I went even further back. Years, then decades. And that's when the pattern became impossible to ignore. There was no easement. Not recorded. Not implied. Not hidden. It simply didn't exist. I leaned back in my chair and let that sink in. Because if there was no easement, then legally the HOA had no right to use my land. And that's when a second realization hit me. For years, HOA residents had been using a small section of my property as a shortcut. It wasn't official. It wasn't paved. Just a path people had gotten used to. Walking dogs. Jogging. Occasionally driving through instead of taking the longer way around. I had seen them do it. I never said anything. I didn't mind. But legally, that wasn't kindness. That was tolerance. And tolerance does not equal permission. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. The HOA hadn't secured access because they never thought they needed to. They assumed the land would always be there, always open, always available. They assumed no one would question it. And now, the same people who had quietly used my land for free were sending me a bill. That irony sat heavy in my chest. I kept reading. State law was clear. Without a recorded easement or written agreement, access across private land could be revoked at any time. No notice required, as long as it didn't violate emergency access laws. And here's the part that made my jaw tighten. If I blocked that shortcut, it wouldn't just inconvenience one or two people. It would affect dozens. Morning commutes would be longer. Emergency response routes would change. Daily routines would be disrupted. Suddenly, that $300 invoice didn't feel like leverage anymore. Felt like a mistake. I realized something important right then. The HOA wasn't charging me because they were strong. They were charging me because they were exposed. They needed my compliance more than I needed their approval. And the moment they tried to force payment, they showed their hand. I printed everything. Maps, statutes, property records. I organized it into a folder, clean and simple. Not to threaten, not to brag, just to be ready. Because at this point, I knew what was coming next. They weren't going to back down quietly. People who rely on assumption rarely do. Sure enough, 2 days later, I got another message. But this one wasn't an invoice. It was an invitation. The HOA board wanted to discuss the situation in person. That wording mattered. They didn't say enforce. They didn't say collect. They said discuss. I smiled for the first time since this whole thing started. Because discussions only happen when certainty disappears. I agreed to the meeting, not because I wanted to negotiate, but because I wanted to watch the moment they realized something they couldn't undo. I showed up early on the day of the meeting. The room was small, neutral, long table, folding chairs, the kind of place where decisions are made quietly and recorded in minutes no one reads. Board members trickled in, greeting me with polite smiles, friendly voices, calm expressions. They looked confident. They had no idea that confidence was about to evaporate. When everyone was seated, the conversation started just like I expected. They talked about community, about cooperation, about shared responsibility. Then they brought up the fee. That's when I placed the folder on the table. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to be noticed. The room went quiet for a second. I opened the folder and slid the first document forward. A county map, then another, and another. Finally, I looked up and asked a question so simple it couldn't be dodged. Can you show me where your easement is recorded? No one answered. They glanced at each other, shifted in their seats. One of them cleared their throat and said something about long-standing use. I nodded. Then I said, calmly, long-standing use isn't legal access. The air changed. I could feel it. That was the moment they realized this meeting wasn't about collecting money anymore. It was about damage control. Because now they weren't just defending a fee. They were defending access they never legally owned. And I hadn't even mentioned the gate yet. The silence after my question didn't feel awkward. It felt heavy. You know that moment when a room realizes it's not in control anymore, but no one wants to be the first to admit it? That's exactly what it felt like. The HOA board members avoided eye contact. Papers rustled. Someone adjusted their chair like that might somehow change the situation. I stayed quiet. Silence can be uncomfortable, but it's also revealing. The longer it stretched, the clearer it became that no one in that room could answer the question I had asked. Finally, one of them spoke. He said something about how residents had been using that path for years. How it had become part of the neighborhood's daily life. How no one had ever objected before. I listened. I nodded. I let him finish. Then I said, calmly, habit doesn't create legal rights. That sentence landed harder than I expected. Another board member jumped in, trying to reframe the issue. She talked about cooperation, about working together, about how the HOA was just trying to be fair. Fair. That word gets thrown around a lot when power is slipping. I opened the folder again and slid another document forward. This one was a highlighted section of state property law. The part that explained easements clearly and without emotion. No recorded easement means no guaranteed access. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse them of anything. I simply read the words as they were written. The mood changed instantly. What had started as a casual meeting now felt like a negotiation neither side had planned for. One of the board members leaned forward and asked, "So what are you saying?" I took a breath. "I'm saying that I don't owe this fee. And I'm saying that the assumption of access across my land isn't supported by law." That was the moment when the conversation stopped being theoretical. Because now they had to confront the implications. They asked if I was threatening to block access. I shook my head. I'm not threatening anything. I'm explaining reality. Reality is a strange thing. You can ignore it for years, But when it finally shows up, it doesn't negotiate. They asked why I hadn't said anything earlier, back when people first started using the shortcut. I told them the truth. I didn't mind, and I didn't think it mattered. But now it did, because now they were charging me money for something they didn't own. And that changed everything. The meeting took a sharp turn at that point. The friendly tone disappeared. The careful smiles faded. They started asking questions they should have asked years ago. What would happen if access was restricted? How many residents used that path daily? Were there alternative routes? I didn't answer those questions. Not because I didn't know the answers, but because they weren't my responsibility. Someone finally said it out loud. So what do you want? That's a powerful question, but only when the person asking it realizes they don't have leverage anymore. I leaned back in my chair and chose my words carefully. I want the invoices to stop. I want written confirmation that I don't owe this fee. And I want acknowledgement that my property isn't subject to HOA authority. No shouting, no threats, and no drama. Just boundaries. They asked if I'd be open to working something out regarding access. I paused. Not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted them to feel the pause. Then I said, right now, I'm just asking you to stop charging me for something that isn't yours. That was it. The meeting ended shortly after. No resolution. No agreement. Just tension hanging in the air like a storm that hadn't decided whether to break. As I walked out, I could feel eyes on my back. Not angry, not hostile, concerned. Because now they weren't sure how this story ended. And neither were their residents. A few days passed. No emails. No letters. Then my phone rang. It was the HOA's property manager. Her voice was different this time. Softer. Careful. She said the board wanted to resolve the situation amicably. That phrase told me everything. They weren't enforcing anymore. They were retreating. But retreats can be deceptive. Sometimes they're just a way to regroup. I told her I'd consider any proposal they put in writing. After we hung up, I walked outside and stood at the edge of my road. I watched a couple of HOA residents walk along the shortcut, laughing, completely unaware of the conversation happening behind closed doors. I didn't feel angry at them. I felt something else. Clarity. Because now I understood the real issue. This wasn't about $300. It was about control. And control only works when no one questions it. That night, I made a decision. Not a loud one. Not a dramatic one. Just a practical one. If this situation wasn't resolved properly, I would have to make reality visible. Not through arguments, but through structure. The kind of structure that doesn't need explanation. And the next time the HOA contacted me, they wouldn't be talking about fees anymore. They'd be talking about access. The proposal arrived 3 days later. Not by certified mail. Not with legal language. Not with threats. Just an email. That alone told me how far things had changed. The message opened with something that would have sounded polite if it hadn't come after weeks of pressure. We'd like to resolve this matter amicably. That word again. Amicably. It's amazing how fast language softens when leverage disappears. They explained that the board had reviewed the situation further. They acknowledged that my property was not technically within HOA boundaries. They said the invoice may have been issued based on assumed access. Assumed. Not legal. Not documented. Assumed. They suggested we find a mutually beneficial arrangement. I read the email slowly once, then again. They still hadn't said the most important words. You don't owe this. Instead, they were trying to pivot, trying to shift from authority to negotiation without admitting fault. I didn't respond right away. Silence, again, was useful. That evening, I walked the length of my road. The gravel crunched under my boots, solid and dependable. This road existed because I built it, because I didn't ask permission, because I didn't rely on assumptions. I thought about how easy it would have been to just use their roads, to sign something, to pay quietly, to let this slide. And I realized something. If I had done that, I wouldn't be standing on this road right now with options. I'd be standing in their system with obligations. The next morning, I replied. My response was short. I thanked them for reviewing the matter. I stated clearly that I did not agree to any arrangement involving fees, access charges, or implied obligations. I reiterated that I did not owe the HOA money, and then I laid out exactly what I wanted. Written confirmation that all invoices were withdrawn. Confirmation that my property was not subject to HOA authority.no future billing. That was it. No mention of access.no mention of shortcuts.no threats. Just closure. A few hours later, my phone rang again. Same property manager. Her tone had changed even more. She said the board was concerned about future misunderstandings. She asked if I would be open to discussing long-term clarity. Long-term clarity. That's what people ask for when they're worried about losing something they don't legally control. I told her I was open to clarity, but not at the cost of accepting obligations that didn't exist. There was a pause. Then she said something interesting. She asked, very carefully, "Do you intend to restrict access across your property?" I didn't answer immediately, because this was the first time they had asked the real question. "I haven't decided," I said. "I haven't needed to." That answer was honest. And it was enough. We ended the call politely. 2 days passed. Then another email arrived. Short, direct. The HOA board had voted to withdraw the invoice. They stated that my account balance was 0. They confirmed that no further fees would be assessed. No apology, no explanation. Just confirmation. I read the email twice. Then I leaned back in my chair and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It was over. At least that's what it looked like on the surface. But something about the timing bothered me. They hadn't suddenly discovered the law. They hadn't magically grown reasonable. They had calculated risk. And they had decided the fee wasn't worth it. That meant something else was worth worrying about. Access. Over the next week, I noticed changes. Less foot traffic. Fewer joggers. People hesitating before using the shortcut. Word travels fast in neighborhoods. Someone had said something. Someone had warned someone else. The HOA hadn't announced anything publicly, but the uncertainty had started spreading. And uncertainty changes behavior. I didn't say anything. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't post signs. I just watched. And as I watched, I realized something important. The shortcut wasn't just convenient. It was relied upon. Parents used it to save time during school runs. Delivery drivers used it without thinking. Some residents had built their routines around it. They had built habits on land they didn't own. And habits feel permanent. Until they're not. That's when I made the next decision. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. Out of clarity. If access was going to exist, it needed to be intentional. Not assumed. So I called a contractor. Not to build anything dramatic. Just something simple. Something quiet. Something that would make reality visible. The contractor came out a few days later. He walked the edge of the property with me. We talked measurements, placement, materials. Nothing fancy. Functional. Clean. As he left, he asked casually, "Gate locked or unlocked?" I paused. Then I said, "Unlocked." He nodded like he understood. Because sometimes a locked gate is a challenge. But an unlocked gate? That's a message. The installation was scheduled for the following week. And when it went up, everything changed. Not because it blocked anyone, but because it forced everyone to notice. The gate went up on a Tuesday morning. No announcement, no warning signs, no emails. Just a contractor, a few tools, and a structure that quietly changed the way people looked at the land. It wasn't tall.it, wasn't threatening.it, wasn't even locked. But it was real. That mattered more than anything. From a distance, it looked almost harmless. A simple metal gate set neatly at the edge of my property where the shortcut began. Clean lines. Neutral color. Nothing dramatic. But the moment it appeared, the shortcut stopped being invisible. For years, people had walked that path without thinking. It wasn't my land in their minds. It was just there, like air, like space between things. The gate changed that. The first person who approached it that morning slowed down. I watched from a distance as they hesitated, looked around, then carefully opened it and passed through. They didn't do anything wrong, but they felt something. Uncertainty. By the afternoon, fewer people used the path. Some stopped at the gate, read nothing because there was nothing to read, and turned around anyway. By the next day, usage dropped even more. Not because anyone was blocked, but because everyone was reminded. This wasn't a public path. This wasn't guaranteed access. This was someone's land, and that psychological shift did more than any locked barrier ever could. A locked gate creates conflict. An unlocked gate creates awareness. Within a week, the shortcut was almost empty. People had adjusted faster than I expected. Routines changed. Cars took longer routes. Joggers found different paths. No complaints reached me, no confrontations, no angry notes. Just quiet adaptation. And then the HOA called. Not the property manager this time. A board member. He asked if we could talk. I agreed. His voice was careful, measured, like someone choosing each word while walking on thin ice. He said the board had received questions from residents about the gate. He wanted to understand my intentions. That word again. Intentions. I haven't changed anything, I said. The land has always been private. There was a pause. He asked if I planned to restrict access further. I told him the truth. I haven't needed to. That answer frustrated him. I could hear it in his silence. Because the hardest thing to argue against is someone who isn't aggressive, isn't emotional, and isn't asking for anything. He asked if I'd be willing to formalize access through an agreement. That was the moment. Not because the question surprised me, but because it confirmed everything I already knew. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about losing control of something they had never officially controlled. I told him I wasn't interested in any agreements at this time. I didn't say never. I said not now. He thanked me for my time and ended the call. After that, nothing happened. No letters, no meetings, no threats. Just silence. Weeks passed. The gate stayed unlocked. The path stayed mostly empty. And something else changed too. The HOA stopped acting like I was invisible. Before this, I was just the landowner next door. Not a member. Not a concern. Not part of their planning. Now they were careful. Careful not to assume. Careful not to overstep. Careful not to provoke. Because they had learned something the hard way. Authority only exists where it's supported. And assumptions collapse when someone checks the paperwork. One evening, I stood by the gate as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the road I had built. A couple approached from the HOA side. They stopped at the gate, hesitated, then turned back without touching it. They didn't look angry. They looked thoughtful. And that told me everything. This wasn't a punishment. It was a lesson. A quiet one. The kind that sticks. I thought back to that first letter. The $300 invoice. The confidence behind the word mandatory. I thought about how easily this could have gone the other way if I had paid it. How one small payment could have turned into permanent obligation. How silence could have been mistaken for consent. Instead, a simple refusal to accept something that wasn't right had shifted an entire dynamic. Not through force, through clarity. And now the HOA had a choice. They could respect boundaries, or they could risk exposing themselves further. So far, they were choosing wisely. But the story wasn't completely finished yet, because there was one final moment, small, quiet, and almost forgettable, that told me exactly how much control they had lost. And it came in the form of a single sentence, spoken casually, without anger, without drama, and it confirmed that this wasn't just a resolved dispute. It was a permanent change. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. No meeting, no letters, no formal notice. Just a casual conversation that said more than any legal document ever could. I was standing near the gate, checking the hinges, making sure everything was still solid. A man from the HOA side approached and stopped a few feet away. He didn't look angry. He didn't look defensive. He looked resigned. He nodded toward the gate and said, almost to himself, "Well, I guess that's your road." That was it. No accusation, no sarcasm, no argument. Just acceptance. And in that moment, I knew the situation was truly over. Because when someone stops trying to control something, they don't announce it. They acknowledge reality and move on. The HOA never contacted me again about fees. No revised invoice. No special assessment. No follow-up disguised as community outreach. The silence wasn't avoidance. It was recognition. They understood where their authority ended. And they understood it because they had tested the boundary and lost. Looking back, the most interesting part of this whole situation isn't what I did. It's what I didn't do. I didn't yell that I didn't threaten lawsuits. I didn't embarrass anyone publicly. I didn't even lock the gate. All I did was ask for proof. That's it. When someone claims authority over you, there are only two things that matter. Do they have the legal right? And are you willing to question it? HOAs often feel powerful because most people never challenge them. Not because they're always right, but because resistance feels exhausting. $300 feels small enough to ignore the principle. But principles don't disappear when you ignore them. They just show up later, more expensive. If I had paid that first invoice, the story would have ended quietly. But it would have ended with me tied to an HOA I never joined, paying for infrastructure I didn't use, and giving up leverage I didn't even know I had. Instead, it ended with clarity. Clear boundaries, clear ownership, clear authority, and a gate that never needed a lock. The road I built still serves its purpose every day. Strong, reliable, independent, and the shortcut? It exists only as a reminder now. A reminder that access is never automatic. That kindness doesn't equal consent. That silence isn't surrender. The HOA learned a lesson too. They learned that confidence isn't power. Documentation is. They learned that routine only works until someone questions it. And most importantly, they learned that control based on assumption collapses the moment reality shows up. If you're watching this and you've ever received a bill that didn't feel right, a rule that didn't quite apply to you, a demand that relied more on confidence than clarity, pause, read, ask, verify, because sometimes the strongest thing you can say isn't no, it's show me where that's written. I didn't build that road to start a fight. I built it for freedom, and in the end, that's exactly what it gave me. Not just freedom from a fee, but freedom from control that never belonged there in the first place. And that's a lesson worth remembering.